he undertook was oriented towards his consolidating his power over the land of France. He had an advisor by the name of William of Nogaret, and William plays a very interesting role and an important part in the story of Boniface VIII. A contemporary described Philip IV as being a body without a soul, who cares nothing about anyone's rights but only wants to increase the wealth of the King of France. So a body without a soul. That's a pretty damning indictment of your personal character. It gives us a sense of this man, Philip the Fair. Now, the King of England at the time is Edward the Longshanks. He's an imperialistic king. He conquers Wales and tries to subject Scotland. Many of us know King Edward from the movie Braveheart. He's the one who William Wallace, portrayed by Mel Gibson, fights against and revolts against in order to try to establish the independency of Scotland. So Philip Boniface, though, is dealing with these Christian kings who really are bent on imperialistic ambitions and on consolidating power in their own realm. And he enters into a conflict with Philip IV in France. And the issue settles around papal revenue and papal taxes. What happened is Edward in England and Philip in France take the revenue, or take the taxes that's collected from church property in their respective realms, and instead of sending it to Rome, they keep it for themselves. And they use it to finance their wars and finance their imperialistic ambitions. Boniface is very upset with Philip IV for doing this, and so he issues first of his three main important bulls during the length of his pontificate. And in 1296, he issues the bull Clericis Laicos. And in this bull, he prohibits the clergy in France from paying the tax. Basically denying, if the king is going to collect the revenue from the tax, then the Pope's counter move to that is to tell the clergy to not pay the tax. So the king now doesn't have the ability to actually take the revenue and keep it for himself. He goes further and says that the secular government cannot collect the tax without specific papal approval. So the King of France is not able to just go out and levy a tax against the church unless the Pope approves it. So again, he's trying to make sure that the church maintains her independency in these different realms. Because of this papal bull, Philip IV was upset, and he arrested the papal representative in France, the papal legate, and charges him with treason. So he kind of ups the ante now against Boniface. Boniface, in response, issues the second of his papal bulls, a bull by the name of Asculte File, which is in Latin. In English, it translates to, "Listen, son." So Boniface, again, here's his lack of charity. He addresses a monarch, a major monarch of Europe, as son. Listen to me, you obviously are not doing what you should be doing. He demanded the release of the papal legate, threatened Philip with excommunication. Now, Philip obviously was upset with the bull, so he ratchets the controversy and the confrontation up another level. He burns the bull and actually declares Boniface to be an illegal pope and deposed. So again, we have this fight between the papacy and a major secular ruler over really temporal matters. Although what is at stake at heart is who controls the church. Is it the secular individual ruler? Is it the major monarch? Or is it the Pope? And that's a big question we've seen the last several centuries in church history, and will continue. Boniface then issues another encyclical, another bull called Unum Sanctum. And in this bull, he says, the spiritual power surpasses in dignity and in nobility any temporal power whatsoever. If the terrestrial power err, it will be judged by a superior spiritual power. But if the highest power of all err, it can be judged only by God. So he basically puts Philip on notice and says the Pope, who exercises spiritual authority, has the highest authority on earth. No temporal authority trumps the spiritual authority, and the spiritual authority of the Pope can actually come in and judge the temporal authority, and even declare a secular prince to be deposed, and to absolve all subjects from their loyalty to the particular king. So again, this is nothing new. We saw this with Pope St. Gregory VII. Other popes in the history of the church have tried to ensure that secular rulers know their boundaries and know that they cannot interfere in the independence of the church. So Boniface's goals and his objectives in his papacy were right and correct. He just didn't go about it in a very diplomatic way. So Philip is still upset with Boniface, so what he decides to do is, through the actions of his chief advisor, William of Nogaret, he decides to launch a kind of secret attack to go down and kidnap Boniface and force him to do what he wants him to, force him actually to resign so that Philip can influence the election of another pope and put somebody more favorably disposed to him. So in September of 1303, William of Nogaret leads a force of 300 knights and 1,000 infantry to where Boniface is staying in his hometown in Italy, and they storm this palace where he's living. And as they storm into his room, Boniface looks at the troops and he says, "Come forward, strike my head. I wish to suffer martyrdom. I wish to die for the faith of Christ. Here is my neck, here is my head." So again, Boniface, a heroic man, he tried to do the right thing. He was willing to sacrifice his life for the independency of the church and the independency of the papacy. He was willing to become a martyr. But again, he lacked that diplomacy to really navigate these difficult political waters during the time of the 14th century. Now, he was held captive for a few days by William and his group of brigands. But eventually the townspeople found out that he was being held hostage in his own house, and so they stormed the palace where he was living, and William and his troops flee. So Boniface, though, a month later, actually, because he was roughed up during his treatment by William, as a result of those injuries and just the stress of the job and of dealing with all these issues with Philip and Edward in England, he dies a month later. So Boniface's legacy really, it's an end of an era, we can say. The end of Boniface's pontificate really shapes for us an end of an era. It's the end of an era when the papacy and the faith were really taken into account as factors in public life of the Christian nations. Really here we can mark the move of Christian nations and the Christian monarchs away from being closely aligned with the papacy. We've seen it in instances before this time, but really this is the time when it when it separates completely and is no longer going to be, they're no longer going to be closely aligned together. Now we're going to have, throughout European history, secular rulers moving in their own direction, moving away from the Pope, not listening to the Holy Father, and trying to control him and even influence the election of certain men to the papacy. So who replaces Boniface VIII is a Frenchman by the name of Clement V. Actually, he replaces him after there's a brief interregnum of a pope by the name of Benedict XI, who reigns only for 1 year. And then after his death in 1304, Clement V comes to the throne, to the chair of St. Peter. Now, Clement V was not a strong leader. He's one of these leaders that really exhibits and exemplifies and embodies our title of weak leadership during this period of time. Now, Philip the Fair wanted Clement, since he was a Frenchman, to do certain things for Philip. He had three basic demands that the Pope do for him. The first demand was he wanted Boniface VIII to be put on trial. Does this sound familiar? It sounds, when we talked about in our time period of missionaries and the emperor, the whole issue of Pope Stephen VII and Pope Formosus. When Stephen VII, through the political maneuverings and manipulations of one of the claimants to the Holy Roman Emperor throne, Lambert II, had Pope Stephen put Pope Formosus, his dead body, on trial. So Boniface is dead. Philip wants Clement to take his body, exhume him, and put him on trial, just like Pope Formosus. That's his first demand. His second demand is he wants Clement to condemn the Templar order. Now remember the Templars. The Templars were one of the military religious orders that resulted from the crusading movement to the establishment of the Crusader states. And they've become very powerful and very influential in Europe, and especially in France, and so Philip wanted them taken care of, and we'll talk about them more in a minute. He also, the third demand he wanted Clement to move the papal residence from Rome to Avignon, to be a little closer to Philip, so Philip could exercise a little more control, a little more authority, and keep the Pope on a tighter leash. Now, as we'll see, all three of these demands, unfortunately, Clement V gave into. Although when we talk about the trial of Boniface VIII, he did open the trial, but it wasn't a very long trial. It wasn't a very long or drawn out or a trial that even came to conclusion. So we'll talk about that in a moment. In terms of the third demand of moving the papal residence to France, Clement gave in to that demand, and he moved his residence from Rome in 1308 or actually announced in 1308 that he was going to move the residence to Avignon. He arrives there in March of 1309. And so the popes will live in the south of France for the next 70 years. Now this was a huge deal at the time. It's even important for us to just keep in mind how important and how devastating, how disruptive this would have been to people in Western Europe at the time. And could you imagine today if the Holy Father decided, which he could, He decided to just no longer live in Rome and instead go live in Toronto, for example, or even Washington, D.C. I mean, it was just, we couldn't fathom that. I mean, the Pope is the Bishop of Rome. He's supposed to live in Rome. Why is he not in Rome? Why is he in Washington, D.C. or Toronto? And we can see, too, how other nations and Catholics around the world might begin to see the Pope in a different light. Well, if he's in the United States, or if he's in Canada, does that mean that he's more favorably disposed to the policies of the United States government? Is he more favorably disposed to the policies of the Canadian government? Who really is the Pope? It begins to weaken in the minds of people the love and respect and affection we should have for our Holy Father, because we begin to see, well, maybe he's not as impartial as he should be, right? And this is exactly what happened at this period of time in the history of the Church, that the papacy began to be associated with France and with the French kings and with French policy. And that had a huge impact on Catholics in Germany, especially the Holy Roman Emperor. It had an effect on Catholics in England, on Catholics in Italy as well. So a huge disruptive event. Now, one thing to keep in mind is Avignon was not under the possession of the King of France. Avignon technically was a papal possession. It had been given to the papacy by King St. Louis IX. So he didn't move necessarily to an area or territory that was governed by the King of France, but it was at least geographically close to the area that the king did control. So that's the third demand. Now, what about the first demand of putting Boniface VIII on trial? Clement agreed to open proceedings against Boniface, and Philip wanted, if Boniface was declared guilty, Philip wanted his name removed from the list of popes, wanted his body to be exhumed, burned, and have his ashes scattered to the four winds. So he was very specific on his demands of what he wanted Clement to do against Boniface. Now, what Clement actually did do was he did start the trial of Boniface in 1310, and of all people, the prosecutor against Boniface VIII was William of Nogaret, the man who actually kidnapped Boniface. So he was the one who was put up as the prosecutor to make the charges and try to prove the charges against Boniface. Now, Clement, to his credit, he did drag his feet through this trial, didn't really have his heart into it, didn't want to do it, and ultimately the trial never came to conclusion. Actually, there were several sessions that he postponed because he had serious issues, serious problems he was dealing with. He had a stomach ache on one occasion, and he felt ill on another occasion, and I think maybe even had a nosebleed on another occasion. So again, his heart wasn't into trying Boniface, but he did kind of start this sham trial nonetheless. Now, what about the second demand of Philip, the demand to suppress the Templar order? How did Clement deal with this? Well, the Templars, as we recall, one of the military religious orders that were founded after the Crusades, or after the First Crusade. And this was, the Templars have actually kind of come into our modern day consciousness because they're kind of seen as this secret little group and control lots of things, and Hollywood is really kind of mythologia, created all this myth associated with the Templars. They were even mentioned in the Da Vinci Code book that we talked about earlier. Now, the Templars, though, again, who they really were, was this military religious order founded in 1120. Their rule, the rule of life, was actually written by St. Bernard of Clairvaux, the man we talked about who had preached the Second Crusade. They were very influential, not only in the Holy Land, but also throughout Western Europe. They were very influential in the Holy Land. In 1150, those 30 years after their foundation, they could muster 600 knights in the Holy Land. It was a large group of troops that they controlled in the Holy Land. In Europe, what happened was people donated money and lands to them, and they became very, very wealthy and powerful as a result. And what they established was something very unique and interesting. They established really, at this time, in the 12th and 13th century, what we know of as ATMs. They established the first ATMs in the world. What you could do during this time is if you had money and you were traveling to the Holy Land, you didn't want to carry the money with you for fear of being, it could be stolen, or you could be robbed, or you could lose it, on a ship, in a shipwreck, or what have you. So you would go with your money to a Templar house in Europe, and you would give them this money, a certain sum of money. Then they would give you a receipt. So you make a deposit to the Templars. They give you a receipt that says, I, John of Salisbury, left, 1,000 pounds to the Templars in this house. So they sign it, and then you could take that bill, that receipt. When you got to the Holy Land, you could go to a Templar house or a bank there, and you would give them your deposit slip and ask for a withdrawal of your money. They would give you your money, minus, of course, a service charge. Just like we pay service charges today, so too these people had to pay service charges when they took their money back from the Templar house. But obviously, as a result of these service charges and the land that they were able to acquire, they became very wealthy and very, very influential. It's estimated that they owned 9,000 feudal lordships and manors throughout Europe. So they were a very influential and powerful group in the church and in Western Europe. Now, Philip was upset with the Templars. He wanted to consolidate power in Europe, or in France rather, and so one of the groups that was in his way of consolidating complete power in France were the Templars. So on October 13th of 1307, Philip ordered the arrest of all Templars in France. Pope Clement V, because of religious order, he has to authorize this edict from the king, and he did. He authorized their arrest. The Templars were rounded up. Philip charged them with such things as denying Christ, spitting on crucifixes, worshiping idols in the shape of a human head, omitting the words of consecration at Mass when they celebrated Mass, and also for practicing sodomy. So when we come back from our break, we'll see then what Clement V did for the Templars and how they ultimately were suppressed, giving in to that demand of Philip IV. Welcome back to Epic, a journey through church history. We're in the time period of weak leaders in schism. We're talking about Pope Clement V and Philip IV, the Fair of France. When we finished, before the break, when we took our break, we were talking about how Philip IV had all these demands that he placed upon Clement V. He wanted Clement to move the papacy to a residence in Avignon in the south of France. He wanted him to suppress the Templar order. And he also wanted him to put Boniface VIII on trial. And as we've seen, Clement V acceded to all of these demands. And particularly in terms of the Templars, Philip arrested all the Templars in 1307 in France, and then Clement V authorized their arrest. And they were charged with certain blasphemous type of activities and also immoral activities. They were charged with denying Christ, of spitting on crucifixes, of worshiping idols in the shape of a human head. They were also accused of practicing sodomy and of omitting the words of consecration at Mass. And so what happened to the Templars is that Clement V convoked an ecumenical council, the Ecumenical Council of Vienne. And this council met in 1311, and it voted to suppress the order. And so the Templar orders were officially suppressed as a result of the Council of Vienne. Clement promulgated the bull, and he was very particular, though, in making sure that he made no decision on their guilt or on their innocence and on all of these charges that Philip levied against them. So there was no promulgation of guilt or innocence. Rather, what was decided was just to suppress the Templars as a whole. The order would just no longer be in existence. All the wealth and power and land that they had accumulated, the wealth and the material and property, were transferred to another religious military order, the Hospitallers. And then there were some orders in Spain who also received some Templar land and Templar property. So now we see how Philip IV was able to control really Clement V, and he gave in to many of his demands, although he did attempt to ensure that there were some modifications to Philip's total demands. Now the popes were in Avignon for the next 70 years. Now as we said, the pope really belongs in Rome. And even though he's not in Rome physically, we still have to remember and acknowledge that he is the Bishop of Rome. So he still has the primacy of St. Peter, the universal jurisdiction across the whole church. He acts as the universal shepherd, even though he's not physically residing in Rome. But we know how much that can be, how disruptive that can be, though, for the Pope not to be in Rome. So it was a very, very disruptive and devastating event in the history of the church. And again, it brought about this loss of respect for the Pope as a whole, and for the papacy and the institution of the papacy. Now also during this time, the church, this dark time in the church in Western Europe, we see the rise of a great disease that comes into Western Europe that greatly impacts the church, and this is the arrival of the Black Death, or bubonic plague. And actually, bubonic plague is carried by fleas, who are on rats, and the fleas then jump to humans, and humans are affected with the plague. Now the bubonic plague kills more than half of its victims. Now when the bubonic plague is brought into colder regions, upwards in northern Europe, it becomes pneumonic plague. It changes and becomes pneumonic plague. And those who contract pneumonic plague, 95% of those victims, or those people,